Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. This month we are reading SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard. And we're doing 3 chapters a week, and the 3 chapters that we're reading today, what are their names? Rome's Great Leap Forward, A Wider World, and New Politics. Really underscore how strange an approach this is that Mary Beard takes to writing about this subject. Of course, there have been a million histories of Rome. And the approach she takes is unconventional. Those million histories of Rome all have the same general contours because a history of Rome is going to be governed by the wealth of sources for any period, which means that histories of Rome tend to swell and go into granular detail over a certain roughly 100-year period when Rome fell from being a representative government of some kind or other to being a complete autocracy, where the state is one person and the military is under the control of one person and one person's whim take the place of law. That transformation is extremely well documented when it comes to ancient Rome. And so soup to nuts histories of ancient Rome, which is what this purports to be, the things that take you from the mytho-history of Romulus and Remus all the way to wherever they go, St. Augustine or the fall of Constantinople or wherever, whatever they choose as their terminus, will have variations like that, where they will skate over periods that aren't well documented and linger over periods that are. And they all usually take that form. They all usually do that. They will start with a couple of chapters about the modern day author tut-tutting about, the way Romans' grandiose mythology reflects on themselves, with stories like the rape of Lucretia or the bloody Tarquins or Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf. And then they'll move on. And usually what happens is that the 1,000 years between the founding of Rome and the Brothers Gracchi are covered in a chapter. But it's an early chapter. Those are early chapters. Gaius Sempronius Gracchus was a tribune of the people. It was a particular kind of office, sort of a roving, living veto. And he chose to take on genuinely populist causes. And that is fairly well documented. We have a fairly good, you can go into great detail about the Brothers Gracchi, but you can't go into great detail about, for instance, civic reforms 100 years before the Brothers Gracchi, or 200 or 400 years before them. Instead, there are peak moments in Roman history that get covered in outsized spotlights. And what usually happens in soup to nuts narrative histories of Rome is that the historian involved will do his best to paper over that fact. He'll do his best to make it seem like a relatively uniform narrative. And the strangeness of Mary Beard's approach here is that she makes no attempt to do that. And that at first, if you're reading this for the first time, that will give this a very strange and a very patchwork feel. We mentioned last time that she starts with Cicero, which is not a normal thing that historians do. They might start with a quote from Cicero, but they don't start with a long detail, the most infamous detail from Cicero's career. There's no way that you can sustain that and still call your book a history of Rome. Now, I believe that this book had its narrative origins in episodic treatments of periods, people, and incidents in Roman history. I don't believe that this was, from the drawing board, ever meant to be a book, much less a history of Rome. It's done really well. It's sold really well. It is considered that way. It's in libraries and bookstores that way. And I'm not going to argue with that because with this reread, I'm seeing how well it serves that, and also how cannily it comments on the narrative traditions that have governed histories of ancient Rome. Those traditions don't have to be there. There's no reason why you have to tell the story that way. In fact, there are good reasons why you wouldn't. The only reason why you would is because you like to create and then preserve the idea of a uniform carpet of sources. That isn't true. And in this book, the main reason why this seems so narratively odd, and maybe some of you are finding it narratively disjointed, is that Mary Beard dispenses with the illusion of that being true, and instead goes to wherever natural emphasis can lay, which will in large part depend on sources. Although even there, a lot of the sources are ancient Roman sources who didn't think about history in a lot of the same ways that we do, didn't think about documentation in a lot of the same ways that we do. In the chapters that we're reading today, you see that clearly, because the gimmick, the narrative technique of starting with Cicero, with the Catiline conspiracy, can't possibly be sustained for 700 pages. If you were reading those opening chapters, you would be within your rights to say, well, okay, this is really good. It's really entertaining. I don't think anyone has a problem with the readability of this book. Mary Beard is never more readable than in this book, except for maybe her new book, which I haven't read, Gods and Emperors. But if you were reading those opening chapters, you might think, okay, well, feels a little disjointed. It's not like any other Roman history that I've read. But it's certainly readable, but you're going to have to get around to the Punic War. So you're not going to be able to just bounce around forever. You're going to have to do more of a straightforward chronological march through events. And in these chapters, she does that. At least partly, she does that. She still does a fair amount of bouncing around. And that bothered me about this book the first 2 times that I read it. I got an advanced copy, and then I got the finished copy. I have no idea what happened to my finished copy. I must have mailed it away to somebody. It would seem like the exact sort of thing that I would keep. And it's in earlier videos on this channel, so I know that I did keep it for a long time. But it's gone. I got the paperback from the publisher. That's fine by me, although the paperback is creaking and groaning. It is definitely creaking and groaning as I put some use into it. What was I saying? Oh, right. It's in these chapters that we settle down to at least the bare bones name checks of a vast amount of Roman history. We know where this narrative is going. This narrative is going to that roughly 100-year period. that is the cynosure of all Roman history, of all written Roman history, no matter what you might think about what used to be called the Servile War, where Rome, as capital of, as a growing magnate of financial and military power, steadily subjected and warred with the independent city-states and nations of Italy. You know that no matter how much you deal with any of that, you are going to get eventually to a stretch of time that is well known and that is dominated by extremely large recognizable names, the first of which is Marius, the Roman consul and general Marius, who pioneered, really trailblazed the idea that the army could be his, and that if the army is his, the state is his. And from Marius, you move on to Sulla and Cinna and Cicero and Cato and the last days of the Roman Republic, and then inevitably Julius Caesar. And then after Julius Caesar, you move on to Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and then Octavian, who becomes Augustus, and that period. So you start off with Marius. When you start off with Marius, if you're the head of your family, you can vote in tribal assemblies in the city of Rome. And it makes a difference. People spend a huge amount of money on those races. Candidates spend a huge amount of money on those races in order to court votes. It's not exactly the same system that we might automatically think of today, for instance, in the United States, but close enough. And at the beginning of that storyline, of that focal period, you have Marius, who I believe loses his mind and becomes vindictive and deranged. Whether you believe that or not, he changes everything. But when he is changing everything back in Rome, or in the Rome that he loves, and where he held property, and where he knew people, and where he married, and in that Rome, people could vote for the people who would rule them. It was a kind of vote. It was a tribal vote. It was a communal vote, but it was a vote. And at the end of that period of time, they couldn't. People could still ruin themselves spending huge amounts of money on elections, but and the people could still show up for those tribal elections, but it was all paste and paper. The state was Augustus. The state was the Praetorian Guard. The state was the legions who would do what Augustus said. And the Senate knew that. No matter how much effort they went to, no matter how many electioneering bills they pasted up on walls, they knew that the power was all in the hands of one man. That period was not long. If you were a not very young man at the beginning of that period, maybe you saw some of the things that Marius was doing, some of the ways he was equipping and ensuring the loyalty of his soldiers, who were called his mules. You could have been a not very young man when you saw that, and you would still not be a very old man when you saw that senators were bowing and scraping to Augustus. That was one lifetime. And you know that this narrative, any narrative by Mary Beard, is coming to that. Unless the historian specifically designates that his book will be about the Servile War, or about the revolt of Spartacus, or about the Punic Wars, these two massive wars and a third that Rome fought with a rival power, Carthage. Unless a historian specifically denotes that their book will be about that, those things will get a fairly short shrift in order to get the narrative to the point where the sources can give us something like legitimate, vivid history of the types that we're familiar with from our hyper-documented post-Gutenberg era. These are the last 3 chapters before Mary Beard gets to that story. And she covers a lot of ground here. She dispenses with the First Punic War in barely any time at all, and then the Second Punic War, which is a massive, a truly epic thing. It's a truly epic conflict. Whole libraries of books have been written about it. It is, of course, the war that features Hannibal and his famous elephants crossing the Alps. It has all sorts of drama. It is, of course, the highlight of the long history of Rome written by Livy. And also, it features prominently in Polybius, who gets a great deal of attention in the chapters that we're reading today. But it doesn't get a whole lot of detailed reconstruction from Mary Beard. She's more interested in writing about the Second Punic War than in writing the Second Punic War, if that makes any sense. Like she mentions at one point. Let me see if I can find it. She talks quite a bit about the famous figures in the Second Punic War, and it's all interesting. It's all really interesting. Like, for instance, she talks about Hannibal himself after the Battle of Cannae, which is an epic, infinitely studied ancient battle between the forces of Rome and Hannibal's forces, in which the forces of Rome are annihilated. And Rome as a city, Rome as the capital of its own empire, is relatively defenseless before Hannibal and his forces. And Mary Beard takes up an oft-asked question about Hannibal, the supposed military genius, which is, why didn't he take Rome? He was in a perfect position to do so. There was no way that the Romans could have stopped him. Why didn't he do it? And she writes, for many analysts, the strategic choices of the Romans and the Carthaginians have been particularly intriguing and revealing. On Hannibal's side, these go far beyond the favorite puzzles about what elephant route he might have taken across the Alps, or whether his reported trick of breaking open alpine rocks by pouring vinegar on them could have worked. In parentheses, she writes, probably not. And the vinegar trick is an oft-repeated little gem. But the question of which route, what kind of route Hannibal's forces took over the Alps, has whole libraries of books devoted to it. This is an infinitely studied subject. The main issue has always been why on earth, after the stunning victory at Cannae, he did not go on to take the city of Rome while he had the chance, but instead gave the Romans time to recover. Livy, who's my guy, I'm not making any pretense about that in these early chapters. Mary Beard is in, whether she wants to be or not, as I mentioned last time, she is in a dialogue with Livy. You can't write about these subjects without being in a dialogue with Livy. But we'll get to Livy in due time. Not in this read-along, but in some other read-along. The main issue has always been why on earth, after the stunning victory at Cannae, he did not go on to take the city of Rome while he had the chance, but instead gave the Romans time to recover. Livy imagines one of Hannibal's officers, by the name of Maharbal, saying to him, quote, You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You don't know how to exploit it. And Field Marshal Montgomery, World War II's famous Field Marshal Montgomery, is only one of many later generals who have agreed with Marharbal. Hannibal was a brilliant soldier and a dashing adventurer who had the final prize within his grasp, but for some unfathomable reason, loss of nerve or some flaw of character, he failed to take it. Hence his tragic glamour. And that last part is Mary Beard, just weighing in on the subject. And that sort of thing generally takes the place of battle by battle recapitulations. I mean, on one level, it's jarring because you're expecting those battle by battle recapitulations. If you read any, massive histories of Rome, I've read a ton of them. You know what you're going to get. It's very predictable. It might even be a little boring, and you very much don't get that in this book. Not in these chapters, anyway. Because, well, there are two possible reasons, and they might both be true. The carpers, the critics of this book, would say that the reason why Mary Beard doesn't go into granular detail about the First or Second Punic Wars, the Third Punic War, or whatever, is because that would have taken more work than she was willing to do for this book, or maybe even some critics might say capable of doing. That's one explanation. That she's skating over the subject because she knows how deep the well goes and doesn't want to get dragged into it. And the other would be that she knows perfectly well, as a historian, how little she has to go on in terms of troop counts, body counts, casualty counts, motivations. Notice she says that Livy makes one of Hannibal's officers say this. Livy's histories are, of course, full of invented speeches. What a modern historian could be forgiven for not really wanting to just cough all that stuff up all over again, especially since it's invented whole cloth. That's one of the kind of biting frustrations with Livy, is that he had access to a vast trove of documents that we would consider historical documents on all of these subjects. He had access to vast amounts of that documentation that does not exist anymore. And we don't know if there were minutes of speeches. We don't have any idea. And if there were, are they reflected in the speeches that Livy has his characters make? I think you'd be foolish to think so, but what if they are? He must have seen them. If there were such things, quotes, the memorandums, whole autobiographies, he must have seen them. And that just wasn't part of what he was doing when he was writing his book. It's maybe like a lot of other people at the time, he probably assumed, if you're interested in reading those things, well, then, get an admission chit to the Julian Library and read them yourself. He probably thought they'd be there forever. He, like every other Roman from the periods that we're talking about, would have stood slack-jawed and aghast with horror if he could stand in Rome today. It would just be, I do not understand what I'm seeing. That portico is over here as part of this building that I don't recognize, but that used to be my friend's doorway, and it was 2 blocks over that way and up this hill a bit. And it was a private house, not part of an official building, and so on and so forth down the line. So it's possible that Livy never thought that he would ever, that it's possible that he knew that he was making art and that he expected that everyone would always be able to see what the real thing was, that he didn't think that was part of writing history. But whatever the reason is, this is the kind of fragmentary, almost impressionistic view that we get of the First Punic War and the Second Punic War and the fights that Rome held with its Italian neighbors, and even the Third Punic War, which can be laid more or less at the feet of one man, one person in the Roman Senate, who insisted that Carthage should be destroyed, that if it wasn't wiped out and the ground salted and just completely destroyed, it could rise again to threaten Rome. And in writing about that man and this period and other figures at this time, Mary Beard betrays, or shows rather, her preference for doing this, which is to keep the reader involved. And I cannot decry that. I've read way too many Roman histories that don't think that's important at all to do. Almost seem to be working against it. So that I'm getting involving portraits here, involving little meditations like that meditation about why Hannibal didn't capitalize on the victory at Cannae. My own hypothesis about why he didn't capitalize would be that we don't know everything about the victory of Cannae, that there are important things we don't know, and that they determined what he wouldn't do. But absent the discovery of some huge trove of documents, we'll never know. But another one of those figures is Cato, Marcus Cato. He was a famous scold to his nation, famously wore, primitive dress, and it was constantly Noam Chomskying his own country. He was constantly saying, "You're the worst. All of you have given in to Greek vices, to Greek luxuries, to overindulgence, and in a general softening of the Roman fiber." In my day, Cato was constantly saying, in my day, men got up for a whole day of business an hour before dawn. They had a piece of bread dipped in vinegar, and that was all they had until supper. Their supper was extremely well contained. All this frippery about people sitting down in theaters and talking during performances and whatnot. Mary Beard gives us a very entertaining portrait of Cato. He shows up in every Roman history because he's such a caricature. But then she gives us an interrogation of that image, which is she regularly does. She writes, "Was this a simple conservative backlash against the newfangled ideas being brought into Rome from outside, a bout of culture wars between traditionalists and modernizers? In part, perhaps it was, but it was also more complicated and interesting than that. For all his huffing and puffing, Cato had taught his son Greek, and his surviving writing, notably a technical essay on farming and agricultural management, and substantial quotations from his speeches and from his history of Italy, shows that he was well practiced in the Greek rhetorical tricks he claimed to deplore." And some of the claims being made about, quote, Roman tradition were little short of imaginative fantasy. There is no reason whatsoever to suppose that venerable old Romans had watched theatrical performances standing up. The evidence we have suggests quite the reverse. I think that's kind of neat that nobody really gets off here. Nobody really gets off with their mythology, and that would be harder to do and a lot less effective, I think, if Mary Beard were writing this book the way a normal history of Rome is written. So the more I rereading this for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, the more I appreciate this approach. I think I would probably agree with, for instance, my own quick thumbnail. My own quick thumbnail of this book when it first came out was that it's really entertaining, but it absolutely should not be your first history of Rome. It's only really going to be appreciated if you know already the stuff that Mary Beard is talking about, at least in broad outline. And I've heard a lot of people since say that, especially when they've seen the huge seller that this was a huge bestseller. And a lot of people have said that, have echoed something like that same thing. This is really, really good. It's really smart. It's really, in its own controlled way, subversive. But it shouldn't be your only history of Rome, and maybe not your first one either. I can see that the validity of that kind of criticism, but I can't. At the present point in my reading life, I can't really imagine what it would be like not to know a lot of this stuff. So I guess maybe I might be exaggerating the danger, so to speak, of reading this book if you don't know any Roman history. I'd love to hear from you all, because that is a perfect way for me to find out. I imagine that a lot of you are reading this book who have not read any big soup to nuts Roman history. I'd love to know how you're faring. Is this throwing you curveballs, or are you appreciating those analytical moments, like the two that I read, where are you getting enough? Is Mary Beard giving you enough of what she's talking about so that when she starts to talk about what she's talking about, you are right there and happily learning a lot or being intrigued or whatnot? Is this book putting you off if it's the first Roman history that you've ever read. I have to believe that it's not, because it was a bestseller. It sold a lot. And much like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall book, I have to maintain that, 85, 90% of the people who made it a bestseller haven't read a Roman history before. But like I said, these chapters that we're reading take us into familiar territory. They take us to Sulla. They take us to the prescriptions of Sulla, where a Roman named Sulla decided to make a list of enemies to the state, which were essentially his enemies. And you could turn them in. You could confiscate their property. It was a horrible, horrible time, and it initiated even worse times. And by the time we get to the end of these 3 chapters, even though we should still be way in the past of Roman history, by the time we get to the end of these 3 chapters, we're talking about Sulla and Marius. And that is our jumping off point for the next 3 chapters. Let's see here. The next 3 chapters are from Empire to Emperors, the Home Front, and the Transformations of Augustus. And you can tell just from those titles that the next 3 chapters are that period that I talked about, the one where all historians of Rome eventually have to go to. That period that is so well documented, so well covered, so well and exhaustively written. That is what's coming up next. The rise and fall of Cicero, who we'll say goodbye to. When we met him, we opened the book with him, but we're going to say goodbye to him in the next 3 chapters. And the part of Roman history that if you know anything. If you know anything about Roman history, you know 2 things: Hannibal and his elephants, and Julius Caesar. And that's coming up next. So those will be the next 3 chapters that we read for next weekend. So let me know in the comments or in email or on Voxer what you're making of this. Are you following along, and are you enjoying it? I'm really enjoying it a lot more, this slow read through, than I did the last time I read it. So very appreciative of having your company while I do that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.